Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining our webinar on regulatory landscape for novel foods. Our idea is to largely cover the regulatory landscape on novel food specifically, but we'll touch upon a few other factors and few other aspects around food as well, because I don't think you can kind of look at novel foods by itself if you don't look at what the distinction is between novel food and other food products, and the way that it is kind of structured in the regulatory framework. But before we jump into the regulatory framework and the webinar itself, let's quickly just get an understanding of what the market is, the evolution of the legislative framework when it comes to food safety. From a market perspective, food obviously is a very inherent factor and a very strong backbone of economic growth for any country. In India specifically, the food sector emerged is a very high growth and high profit sector. The Indian food processing industry itself is a very fast growing sector, and the expectations are that output would reach close to around $550 billion by 25-26. This is obviously backed by the assumption that the government initiatives such as the planned infrastructure, which is close to around $1 trillion worth of investment that the government is planning to do in the food processing sector, as well as other schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Sampada Yojana, etc., which will probably catapult this to a $550 billion market. Currently, the food processing industry has close to a little over 10% of share in exports. And from an employment standpoint, we could say that it contributes almost 12% of employment. And this does not include the unregistered or the part of the food processing sector which is unaccounted for. And that the estimates are that there are close to around 5-6 million people who are employed in this unorganized sector of the food processing industry. We've seen the FDI investments. We've kind of, in the country itself, we've seen a fair bit of activity in the FDI investments in the food sector. Equity inflows in the year 21-22 was close to around 700 million or a little over that. And it has increased in the years after that. And if you look at the last 2 decades, the investments, foreign direct investments in the food sector has been close to around $11-12 billion. While we talk about food overall, specifically, we are looking at novel foods in this instance, and therefore the alternative protein segment, which is a core part of novel foods, is something that we should look at. And from an industry standpoint, from a report by BCG, the market for alternative meats, dairy, and egg products is estimated to reach at least around $300 billion by 2035. In addition to just the fact that this is going to be beneficial for human health, the shift to such alternatives will play a very large role and contribution to the efforts in combating climate change. Global food production is probably the single largest driver of environmental impact and degradation. If the current global food systems continue as is, there would be an irreversible damage to the planet for meeting the nutritional demands of a growing world population. So therefore, it is necessary to look at alternative proteins and alternative food sources to kind of meet the demands of the world population. That's overall from a market standpoint. The second part that we just wanted to quickly touch upon before we get into the specifics is how has food safety laws evolved over the years in the country. So if we go back in time, the first legislation which covered food safety was the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act, which was enacted in 1954. This was largely to kind of look at food safety with respect to adulteration. This was also supplemented with various other orders which came along, which was the meat food products order, the food products order, there was the milk and milk products order, there was a vegetable oil control products control order. So various other orders came along to supplement what was already there in the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act. The main issue with the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act was that its approach to food safety was only with respect to adulteration of food products. When the technology and regulatory practices worldwide had moved on to a more risk-based determination of standards, holding manufacturers of food responsible for safety through documented safety practices, rather than solely by just taking samples from the market. The FSS Act or the Food Safety Standards Act is one of the most progressive legislations from what we have kind of, when you compare it with other legislations across the world. It contains an inbuilt safety valve against the misuse of law. It recognizes the relationship between law, science, and technology. It harmonizes India's food regulations as per international standards, and kind of this was the act which consolidated all of the earlier regulations and statutes and repealed all of the earlier ones, including the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act. It established a new national regulatory body in 2008, which is the FSSAI, or the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, which is the apex regulator to develop science-based standards for food to regulate and monitor, manufacture, processing, storage, and all of the other aspects around food. It's obviously empowered by and functions under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Prior to the establishment of FSSAI, Indian consumers had never been known to question a product's efficacy. FSSAI helped in moving that and changing that perspective. It was a significant step towards ensuring consumer protection and product quality in India, played a very important role in shaping a consumer-friendly regulatory landscape for the food industry. And it also helped in providing the necessary access to essential information on food products through labels, labeling requirements, advertising requirements, etc., enabling the customer or the consumer to make an informed choice. Additionally, FSS Act and FSSAI has simplified the licensing process for food business, because it kind of consolidates the licensing process and the regime in relation to different kinds of food products. And it's not just limited to food products, it also goes on to food business operators. So everything's encompassed in this one statute and the regulations around it. How is it, just to give a quick categorization, how the act itself or the legislation itself categorizes food before we jump into the specifics of the webinar. There are two categorizations that the FSS Act does under the statute. One is standardized food products, and the second is non-standardized food products. When it comes to standardized food products, I think, as the name suggests, there are standards which are prescribed. Therefore, there is no requirement to go to the FSSAI for a product approval or for the food approval of the product itself. Any food business operator will still need to take a license in the first instance to have a business in relation to food. Non-standardized, in contrast, are those for which standards are not prescribed. That means that they are either not known or not yet ascertained. So that's the fundamental difference between the two categories of food products under the FSS Act. We'll get into more detail as we go along with the webinar. Before we start, let me give you a quick introduction to the firm. We are a full-service law firm. Spiceroot Legal is a full-service law firm, and we've been in operations for the last seven odd years. We have a specific, one of the sectors that we focus on is healthcare, life sciences, and the pharmaceuticals industry, and food is part of that. We work with a wide range of clients in the sector, right from big pharma to small manufacturers and new and innovative product manufacturers in the food industry. My name is Praveen Raju. I'm the founding partner, and I lead the corporate practice group with a specific focus. One of the sectors that I focus is on healthcare, life sciences, and healthcare and life sciences. My colleague Swarna is an associate with the firm. She also is part of the corporate practice group and focuses very much on life sciences and healthcare, but with a specific focus on food specifically. Felina is an associate in the same team. She also looks at food as a specific sector and looks at other healthcare and life sciences aspects. She's also very closely involved in corporate transactions, private equity, and venture capital transactions. So that's us. Of course, towards the end, we will kind of give you our contact details. I think some of our contact details here, you can reach out to us. But before we start, please also note that there is a Q&A box over here. So please feel free to kind of put in your questions over there. We will, through the course of the seminar, or once we finish the webinar, we will be able to kind of take up those questions. So over to you, Swarna. So why don't you start by explaining what, or giving an introduction to novel foods and explaining what the regulatory framework is currently in India under the FSS Act.
Yeah, thank you, Praveen, for the introduction and also for setting the context for today's discussion. Hi all, thank you for joining us today. Let's first understand what is novel food. To simply put, the term novel food refers to food that does not have a significant history of human consumption, or either it's produced in a new way. This term itself is often used in policies and regulations, and different countries and geographies have adopted their specific definition. To give you a few examples, like European Commission, they define the novel food as food that was not consumed significantly in Europe itself prior to May 1997, and it includes new foods, food from new sources, new substances or ingredients used in food, or foods and ingredients produced through new production technologies and methodologies. On the other hand, if you see Canada's novel food regulation, novel food there, it should meet the criteria, which is no history of safe use as a food, a process that has been previously applied to food or causes the food to undergo a major change, or lastly, food which is derived from a genetically modified plant, animal, or microorganism. And lastly, if we see India, under Indian regulation, novel food is defined as food product that does not have a history of consumption by humans, that does not have history of consumption of any ingredient used in it, or either the source from which it is derived. And lastly, if any ingredient that is obtained by using new technology or innovative engineering process. So these are the different definitions under different jurisdictions. Now coming to the categories, moving on to the next slide. There are three categories within the novel food which we've seen in the market today. The first one is the plant-based food. Now, plant-based food are foods that mimics the taste, the texture, and the nutrition of conventionally produced products. Like when we say milk, it is not only limited to your conventional animal-derived milk, but due to the innovation in the technology, includes plant-based milk too, which may be produced through fermentation of nuts or cereals, including oats, peanuts, soy, or almonds. However, the plant-based food is not only limited to your dairy products, but also includes meats and eggs too. There are several Indian companies who have now entered into the market. Like to give you a few examples, One Good, which is amongst one of the first Indian plant-based dairy companies, it offers variety of vegan dairy products including milk, cheese, cream, yogurt alternatives made from nuts and seeds. Uh, Another similar company, Sofit, which was acquired by Hershey's India, has been a front runner in the market for plant-based milk. As I said earlier as well, plant-based products are not only limited to plant-based dairy products, but also include plant-based meat. Like this company, Wesley Food, is an Indian plant-based food company which offers range of meat alternatives, including burgers, sausages, nuggets, which are made out of ingredients like soy or pea protein. This was the first category. The second category within the novel food is cell-based products. Now, these products typically involve extraction or multiplication of a muscle sample taken from an animal to allow differentiation into full muscle tissue, like cultivated or cultured meat or eggs or seafood. And with the growing market today, global clean meat economy is expected to be worth $450 billion by 2040. And that is signified through several businesses who have entered into the cell-based segment producing cultivated meat or cultured meat. Um, to pause here to take a few examples, like this Dutch startup called Mosa Meat. It produces meat from cultured animal cells. And even there is a company in California called Eat Just, which has a specific meat division called Good Meat. And they have received recently regulatory approval from both Singapore Food Agency and US FDA for its cell cultured chicken, which has paved the way for lab grown meat to be eaten by consumers. The last category under the novel food is the fermented base food. It is basically a process that involves the use of technology to conduct fermentation process of microbial organisms in order to make a food product out of it, like extracting roots of the mushrooms and using fermentation to produce a protein or a fiber or micronutrient rich ingredient. Like this company in US, which is called Prime Roots, they use biomass fermented fungus called koji to make alternatives to meat and seafood. Another example of fermented based food is tempeh, which is made out of soy. It's made by fermenting the cooked beans into a cake-like solid block. So these are the three categories of novel foods that can be seen in the market today. However, among the three, moving on to the next slide, plant-based food market has grown substantially. And as shown in the study conducted by Bloomberg Intelligence in 2021, it stated that by 2030, the plant-based market is expected to be worth 162 billion, which will account for 7.7% of global protein market. And if similarly the alternative meat market mimics this growth, it can expand up to 74 billion in the next decade, from 4.2 in 2020. Uh, the deriving of the several factors that derive the purchase decision of the consumers of these novel food. Moving on to the next slide. So there are several Indian companies who are serving consumers these plant-based dairy products, which satisfy the sensory, the functional, and the taste requirements of the consumers. But however, these purchase decisions are derived not because of the market trends, but also because of the dietary restrictions, such as lactose intolerance or issues concerning milk digestibility. There was a study which showed that almost 60% of India's population suffers from varying degrees of lactose intolerance. So, plant based dairy options are thus necessary for this larger part of consumers who, because of their dietary requirements, choose not to go towards animal derived milk. The other factor that derives these decision is sustainability and environmental impact. and users have cited environmental friendliness, sustainability, animal welfare, and even plant-based origin as some of the key reasons for their purchase of these products. Uh, the concern is stemming from multiple reports, which have highlighted that the risk of dairy intensification, which is increasing the milk yield per cow. And even an Oxford study found that while meat, aquaculture, eggs, and dairy use accounts for almost 83% of world's farmland and contributes about 56 to 58% of food's different emissions, they only contribute to 37% of our protein and 80% to our calories. So plant-based foods have lesser environmental impact compared to conventional food, as Praveen also mentioned. And when it comes to greenhouse gas emission, eutrophication, acidification, and even frequent land use. Moving on, coming to the regulatory framework of novel foods in India, it is governed by Food Safety and Standard Act of 2006, and there are several regulations made within this FSS Act 2006. They define the novel food as an article of food for which standards have not been specified, but is not unsafe, or any prohibited ingredient is not used as provided in the Act. This Act also prohibits manufacturing, distribution, sale, or import of any novel food within India in a manner that is not prescribed in the Act. The next regulation under the FSS Act is the FSS Nutra Regulation of 2016. It states that no novel food shall be manufactured or imported for commercial purpose without prior approval of food authority. The prior approval process itself is provided under the FSS approval of non-specified food and food ingredient regulation of 2017. And my colleague Felina will be providing a analysis of the prior approval process in the upcoming slides. Lastly, since we are talking about plant-based products, which is one of the categories under the novel food, the regulators have come up with a specific vegan food regulation in 2020. What is vegan food? It is any type of food or food ingredient that does not contain any animal-derived products and ensures that no such materials are even used during the production or processing of these foods. As per the vegan food regulation, there is a prior approval required of FSSAI by submitting an application if the food business operator opts to endorse the logo on the product. In addition to the application, there are certain compliances that the food business operator will need to follow, like no animal testing can be done while they are producing or processing the product. They should ensure that good manufacturing practices are followed, and every package must carry the vegan logo as prescribed by FSSAI, and no food product shall be imported except with a certificate of the recognized authority of the exporting countries. So these conditions have to be met by food business operator before the vegan products enter the market. Moving on, since we have seen that there is a significant market capture by the plant-based products, one of the recent developments that we would like to highlight here is the FSSAI, through an order in 2021, has prohibited the companies from using the terms milk, butter, cheese on their plant-based products. The reasoning behind this order was that general standard milk and milk products under the previous regulation did not permit the usage of dairy term for a plant-based product. The order also required that names of dairy analog products must not contain any dairy term, which is either phonetically similar or spell-alike term. and even the product should reflect the true nature of the product. There were actions taken against the company who were flouting this rule, and even e-commerce websites were asked to delist the plant-based products using such terms. However, from this order, coconut milk and peanut butter was spared because of their international acceptance of those terms. Currently, this order is challenged in Delhi High Court by several plant-based product manufacturing companies. And even to oppose this order, an organization had conducted a survey which showed that the consumption behavior is similar for plant-based milk and animal-derived milk. They are typically consumed either as a whole or along with your cereals or in your tea or coffee. So retaining the word milk or spell-alike terms uh, on the plant-based dairy products will allow consumers to understand their core functionality and will avoid any confusion, whereas doing otherwise may lead to ambiguity. Even in our opinion, it would be counterproductive for the plant-based milk and similar products to be labeled as, for example, almond drink, because this terminology would be foreign to consumers and be less indicative of what the product actually is. Similarly, if you use the term beverage, it will be an overboard as the current consumer perception and the FSSAI's inclusion of these products under beverages will not do justice to the nature of the end product and will require further consumer education, your awareness, and clarification to introduce this product as such. As the currently stands, the court has temporarily permitted plant-based companies to use the dairy terms until their final order is out on this issue. So let's keep an eye out on the final decision of the court.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, Swarna, if I may just jump in here, but just to add to that as well, if you look at the comparables in other jurisdictions. So, for example, the European Union, the Commission over there, the European Commission has created a specific list of products that are allowed to use milk and other dairy terms in their names. This is an exception which has been created by the Commission, applicable to the description of products, the exact nature of which is known because of traditional use, and or when the designations are clearly used to describe a characteristic quality of that product. For example, like butter, shea butter, nut butter, coconut milk, and all of that. If you take a look at US, the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act and the authorities over there recognize the use of common or usual names of a product specifically for which no standard of identity is defined or developed. Even the judgments delivered by courts in the US have allowed the use of compound names for plant-based milk products and have found that they are not imitation products. For example, almond milk was held not to be an imitation milk, as the jury was unable to conclude that almond milk was nutritionally inferior to milk. It also held in the same judgment that consumers are able to differentiate between conventional or animal-derived milk and almond milk. So therefore, we believe that the courts in India will also go down that path, because the ability, like Swarna mentioned, it is two ways. I think one, from a consumer perspective, to understand that this is a product which can be used in replacing a conventional product, or for a manufacturer to kind of convey that message can only be possible if it kind of is able to use such common names. Of course, in the US, I think that they had various other arguments on fundamental rights to kind of use the name, etc. But I think we won't get into that right now. Felina, do you want to kind of now step in and probably kind of get into the details of how the prior approval process in relation to novel food products in India is governed under,
Sure,
and what are the
Praveen.
requirements from an
But
FSSAI?
before we go into the prior approval process, let's just take a step back and understand the different broad categories that food products and ingredients are divided into under the regulations. And the first category are those foods for which standards have been provided under the food safety and standards regulations. For example, you have standards for milk and dairy products, fruit products, vegetable products, etc. Now, the second category of foods are proprietary foods, foods for which standards have not really been provided under the regulations, but individual ingredients which make up the product, those ingredients have been standardized. For example, if you take energy drinks, right, they have ingredients which have starch, dextrose, flavor, specific color. So all those specific ingredients standards have been provided, but energy drink as a food product itself, standards have not been provided. So that would fall under the proprietary food category. Now, the third category would be novel foods for which standards have not been provided under the regulations, nor do they fall under the proprietary food category. So, Swarna had mentioned earlier that various jurisdictions have different interpretations of what novel foods are. Like, for example, in the European Union, those foods which have not been consumed prior to 1997 in the European Union or in the United Kingdom would be considered as novel foods. However, in India, although it has the general definition of, no history of consumption or there must be a new technology involved, currently the regulators have slightly deviated, where if the food or the food ingredient, which is, if it's present in any other market across in any other country, it would not constitute a novel food, but a non-specified food. For example, like Swarna had mentioned, good meat, which had lab-grown meat based out of chicken, which has entered the market in Singapore and the US. So in India, if an FBO wants to manufacture a product out of a lab-grown meat out of chicken, it would constitute a non-specified food, but not a novel food. However, say if they were to make meat products from cells like any other animal, for example, duck or any other animal, then it would constitute as a novel food because there is no other country which has such regulatory status for that kind of lab-grown meat. Now, with respect to the prior approval process, both novel foods and non-specified foods require prior product approval. However, there are certain additional information that novel food manufacturers would need to complete in their application form for prior product approval versus a non-specified food manufacturer. Now, also, Swarna had also mentioned that the FSS 2016 regulations govern novel foods, right? So these regulations were superseded by the 22 regulations, which apart from covering health supplements, nutraceuticals, food for special dietary use, food for special medicinal purposes and all of that, also included prebiotic and probiotic food, which was not covered in the 2016 regulations. We had covered this in one of our previous webinars. But these regulations specifically exclude novel foods from its application, and therefore it continues to be governed by the 2016 regulations and the 2017 non-specified regulations. Now, the 2022 regulations have certain specified ingredients in certain quantities, and only if it falls within that particular bracket of quantity and ingredient can it qualify as an ingredient in a nutraceutical, and only then could it qualify as a nutraceutical or a health supplement, etc. Now, if an FBO wishes to manufacture a product under any of these categories, which includes an ingredient which is not provided in the 2022 regulations, it would need the prior product approval of the FSSAI. So, and in its application to the FSSAI, it will need to mention the end use of the product. So the end use becomes very important, that it wants to be categorized as either a nutraceutical or a health supplement. And once it provides its end use and it gets the prior product approval, then it can be qualified to be called as either a nutraceutical or a health supplement, etc. Now, getting into the prior product approval process, this is governed under the Food Safety and Standards Non-Specified Regulations of 2017. Now, there's no prescribed time frame under these regulations for the prior approval process, but from our experience, we understand that it could take anywhere between 7 months to about a year and a half, depending on the kind of documents, safety studies that are available in other countries, the regulatory status in other countries versus in India, and then the FSSAI decides whether the kind of time frame would be required for studying whether the product is viable for the consumers. So for the procedure, an FBO will need to who manufactures or imports or wants to import a non-specified or a novel food will need to submit an application to the FSSAI along with necessary documents, which could include a certificate of analysis from a national or international accredited laboratory, which covers the physical, chemical, and microbiological parameters relevant to the product, along with test methods, the entire comprehensive manufacturing process, like I mentioned, the regulatory status in other countries, the safety information documents pertaining to the particular product, etc., to the FSSAI. Now, the authority will examine the application and the information provided by the FBO and conduct a risk assessment process. And on preliminary scrutiny, it will inform the applicant of any deficiencies that it can identify within the product within 45 days from the date of receipt of the application. Now, let's just look at the risk assessment process that the FSSAI basically undertakes, because it also becomes important for FBOs while they're conducting safety studies and submitting their documents to keep in mind what the FSSAI is really thinking about and how their process goes when it comes to doing the risk assessment, right? So basically, the authority checks for any risks in the novel food which could cause an adverse health effect on the health of the consumers and the severity of that effect. There are basically four broad steps to this risk assessment process. There's hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. Now, in the first step, which is the hazard identification step, the FSSAI identifies the biological, chemical, and physical agents which are present in the product, which is capable of causing an adverse health effect. Now, in the next step, which is hazard characterization, the FSSAI defines parameters that may influence whether the identified hazard in the previous step is capable of causing an adverse health effect. In a particular level of dosage. For example, there might be a certain level of dosage which could cause a risk to actually happen. And if it's in a certain lesser level of dosage, it might not really happen. So they really check that as well, to what levels of dosage would it really cause an adverse health effect. Now, in the next step, which is exposure assessment, the FSSAI evaluates what is the likely intake of that particular physical, chemical, or biological agent, as well as the exposure, not just from that particular product, but from any other source that I could possibly intake it from. Now, the final step, which is risk characterization, they look at all the previous steps and they estimate how likely and severe the occurrence of any potential adverse health effect that they've identified in a particular given population under certain defined exposure conditions would be, and would then come up with the answer of whether this product is really viable for consumers and should be out into the market. Now, this risk assessment process will be conducted based on the safety information documents which are submitted by the FBO, which could include peer-reviewed journals, preclinical and clinical trial studies, which must follow the new drugs and clinical trial rules of 2019. And if there is any lacunae or something, they can refer to the guidelines provided by the Indian Council of Medical Research regarding clinical trials, in case there is any lacunae in the kind of regulations that the new drugs and clinical trials rules have come out with. Also, it's important to note that clinical trials is mandatory for novel foods prior to their introduction to the Indian market. And apart from this, they may also require evidence of impact to certain specific population groups that they are basically, targeting. For example, lactating mothers or certain specific groups that they're targeting. They need to have evidence of impact as well as documentation for the intended health benefits that they are claiming. Now, during this process, the FSSAI may ask the FBO to submit additional documents, data, clarification if required, which the FBO will need to submit within 30 days from issuance of the letter by the FSSAI. An FSSAI's experts committee or panel will be set up to evaluate the application from the FBO. And once the risk assessment is completed, they may either grant approval or reject the application. Now, once this approval is given, the duty of the FBO doesn't just stop there to check the safety of the product. After the approval of the product, they will also need to conduct and provide post-market surveillance data on the relevant safety and efficacy parameters of the product within 1 year of placing the product in the market whenever asked by the FSSAI.
Yeah, Felina, I think we should answer the question that comes up a lot, that if the product poses a risk to the health of the consumers after the post-market surveillance is conducted by the food business operator, then what they should do?
Sure, Swarna. So basically, the FSSAI has also considered that as well. So if an FBO has any reason to believe that the approved food product could pose any risk to the health of the consumers, they will need to immediately take steps to suspend the manufacture, sale, production, distribution of the product, and take steps to recall this immediately from the market and intimate the FSSAI about it. So you have specific regulations for this called the Food Safety and Standards Food Recall Procedure Regulations of 2017, which specifically talks about the recall procedure and the intimation to the FSSAI in case they find out that the product is unsafe, either during the post-market surveillance or anytime later as well. So this is basically a brief on the prior product approval process that's there in India.
Sorry, Felina, if I may just step in here. Sridevi, I think that you had a question. So just before Felina moves on to the next thing, I think Sridevi, you had a question. I think she covered it in this slide, if I'm not mistaken, but let me know if we'll get to that as well. Sridevi, we got your next question. I think we'll get to that as well. Yes.
So we're also going to quickly look at the prior product approval and safety assessment in other jurisdictions as well. So as particularly, we're looking at Singapore and the European Union. In Singapore, similar to India, food business operators that intend to manufacture, import, or sell novel foods must conduct and submit a safety assessment of the products to the Singapore Food Agency for review and approval. Now, the Singapore Food Agency focuses on regulating the end product, like the nutritional information of the product itself, more than the entire process of manufacturing that particular novel food. But it still somewhat recognizes the safety, the importance of establishing overall market safety of the product and overall product safety. So, for example, the pre-market approval of novel foods, which are animal cell-based, the Singapore Food Agency basically, apart from requiring information on the product, like I mentioned, nutritional information and the composition, etc., it also requires the identity of the source cells and the stem cells of the product itself, and the chemicals which are used for the induction of the product, and also biopsies that are basically being conducted on the animal to extract the animal cells, whether they are in line with animal welfare regulations, safety regulations, etc. And once they conduct the risk assessment process and they understand that the product is basically safe for consumption, they give the approval and the FBO can go ahead and manufacture, sell the product in the market. Now, in the European Union, similarly, the pre-market approval is provided by the European Food Safety Authority after conducting a thorough risk assessment process. Now, during this process, the EFSA verifies information about the compositional, nutritional, toxicological, and allergy-related properties of the product, and whether this particular product is, the kind of production purposes that it's intended for. The end purpose of the particular product is also considered when they're going ahead and, assessing the risk related to the product. Now, post this risk assessment process, if the opinion of the EFSA is positive, then the European Commission drafts an implementing act, which basically lays down the specific conditions of use, example, labeling requirements or monitoring arrangements that, the FBO will have to keep in mind. And after which the European Commission will place the product. There's a union list of novel foods, which the European Commission will place this particular product in. And also the implementing act that the European Commission issues will need to be adopted by the member states. So this is again a brief of two jurisdictions that we've taken, but the process is slightly similar to what we follow as well, but also to a certain extent, slightly less, very procedural, like there's a detailed procedure for, the prior product approval in India. Now, once the FBO has received the prior product approval, it can apply for a license under the Food Safety and Standards licensing regulations. So any person who is engaged in the production, processing, storage, distribution, sale, or import of a novel food or non-specified food is required to obtain a license from the licensing authority. Also, this is a mandatory requirement because if you don't obtain a license, it will attract imprisonment of up to 6 months and also a penalty of up to 5 lakh rupees. So there are different kinds of licenses and registrations that you can obtain under the licensing regulations provided by the FSSAI. But specifically for non-specified foods and novel foods, the FBO will have to obtain a central license only. And also the regulations don't just cover, the procedure for obtaining a license, which we'll cover next, but they also provide for any renewals in the license that you've obtained. If there's any change in the business, that will need to be appropriately communicated to the authority and also approved by the authority. Now, quickly looking into what the procedure for license is. The application will have to be made with certain additional documents, like a self-attestated declaration on the food safety management system that the FBO employs, a blueprint or layout of the plan of the food processing unit, details of the equipment that the FBO is using in manufacturing the product, etc., along with the prescribed license fee and any additional documents that the FSSAI notifies in its orders, etc. Also, the applications and documents are supposed to be processed within a period of 15 days from the receipt of application. And if any further information or inspection is required, it will need to be completed within 30 days of the application, and the license will have to be granted within a period of 60 days from the date of submission of the complete application. So in case there is a refusal of license by the FSSAI, the decision will need to be communicated to the FBO with the reason for refusal within that stipulated time. And if the FSSAI does not go ahead and, either provide a rejection or an approval or the reason for rejection, the FBO can automatically start its business even if it does not get the approval, because that 60 period time has been lapsed. Also, regarding the validity of the license, prior to 2023, an FBO could get a license for a period from anywhere between 1 to 5 years. However, more as a recent development in 2023, the FSSAI held that the license can only be valid for a duration of 1 year. And if they want to have it for more than a year, there are annual renewals that an FBO will have to go on the portal and renew their license annually. Now that we've gone through the approval process and the licensing requirements of the product, however, before the product enters the market, there are certain regulations that the FBO will need to comply with when it comes to labeling, packaging, advertising of the product. So we're just going to look at some of the general labeling requirements of products. So there are certain basic general requirements, like the food declaration must either be in English or Hindi in the Devanagari script. It must also have, it can't create any false impressions and must be accurate. But also specific labeling requirements that you can see on your screen with respect to, the name of the food, the list of ingredients, the nutritional information of the product, which will have to be provided per 100 grams or per 100 ml or per single consumption pack of the product. And there must also be a per serve percentage contribution to the recommended dietary allowance, which is calculated. Additional requirements like declaration, whether it's veg or non-veg, the FSSAI logo and license number, all of this information that you can see on your screen will basically need to be provided by the FBO on the label of the product. As just an example or an illustration of where FBOs go wrong when they come to labeling their products, if you can see in the next slide, the image on the right, there is no per serve percentage contribution to the RDA, which is calculated, which is a mandatory requirement. However, you see the image on the right, they have the per 100 grams, they have the per percentage RDA, which is calculated, which is requirement. Although this isn't a requirement for non-retail packs, however, any product that needs to be sold on a retail basis will have to have all these requirements satisfied. Otherwise, you open yourself up to penalties and offenses under the FSSAI regulations. There are also certain exceptions. For example, pre-packaged foods may not have to comply with. For example, packages which are less than 100 square centimeters will not have to provide nutritional information. And also there's certain specific information that needs to be provided on the principal display panel of the label, which basically is the part of the package that the consumer sees as soon as they pick up a product. So the size of the principal display panel and the information that's provided is what these regulations cover. Now, there are also certain specific logos that the FSSAI has provided for certain categories of food products. So under the food safety and standards vegan food regulations, the seller of vegan foods, either exclusively or as part of a retail merchandise, will need to store and display such products in a manner which is distinguishable from non-vegan food. Also, labels of vegan foods after the approval will need to carry the logo that you can see, the V logo. It can't have, like we've highlighted what logos can't be used, but the V logo is the correct logo to be used under the regulations. Now, there was a question which came up to the FSSAI on whether terms like vegan salami or plant-based egg powder or vegan sausages, or basically any term, vegan chicken, which basically is any term which combines the term vegan and meat, can be used for the vegan logo endorsement. And the FSSAI came out and said in one of its FAQs that the term vegan cannot be clubbed with meat and meat-based products like salami, chicken, bacon, etc. on the label. And no claim comparing the product to meat products in any sensory manner can be used. However, we think that this move is counterproductive to FBOs who want to market their products as alternatives to meat products, right? And we fail to see any reasonable explanation for this move by the FSSAI. For example, a client whom we had spoken to was in the process of manufacturing mycelium, which is basically the root of mushrooms, for processing it into a plant-based alternative, which has the same taste and the same texture as meat itself. Now, by not allowing him to market his product as vegan meat, and maybe him having to call it vegan patty or vegan protein, etc., is going to limit his audience or his reach to consumers that he is targeting in a huge way, right? So we don't exactly understand what the FSSAI is worried about as well, because I don't think consumers are going to get either confused about a term like vegan meat or vegan chicken, which is quite self-explanatory, right? So this move by the FSSAI could also be a huge blow to vegan meat sellers, and we believe that the FSSAI must reconsider its decision from prohibiting FBOs to advertising their products as vegan meat. Because this has actually basically resulted in FBOs not even willing to try to come under the vegan regulations and follow the regulations provided under the vegan regulations, which basically render the entire vegan regulations redundant, because the FBOs are not willing to even come under it because they can't call themselves vegan meat or vegan butter chicken or anything of that sort, that they're basically targeting their consumers, right?
So just to add, sorry, Felina, if I may say, I think it's also the presumption that the consumers who are consuming these products are not discerning customers, right? Or discerning consumers. So I think that probably the regulator, I think it probably maybe with good intentions that the regulator is doing this, or with the intention saying that, one, to protect consumers or to kind of ensure that there is no consumer who's consuming this on the presumption that this is meat. To the fact that maybe also driven by the fact that, meat itself, when you say vegan, there is an implication that it has to be vegetarian, vegan in nature. But yeah, I think that's probably a far-fetched assumption. But hopefully, I think that they are able to kind of look at these aspects in a little more holistic perspective. Also borrow from how it's not necessary that all of the aspects that are kind of decided in the West necessarily needs to be kind of similar here when it comes to consumer attributes over here in India. But I think that, keeping in mind the fact that they are discerning customers, maybe these kind of restrictions should be avoided to enable food business operators to kind of create a larger range of products across all of this. Sorry, Felina, you can continue.
Yeah. So there are also like other logos as well that a FBO can, for example, there is the organic food logo, which has the Jaivik Bharat logo, that FBOs who comply with standards in the food safety and standards organic food regulations, if they comply with those regulations, they can have the organic food logo attached to their label. Now, we're also going to look at the packaging regulations that FBOs will need to comply with. If we can move to the next slide.
So, sorry, hold on. I think that before we move on to the next slide, Swarna, Felina, you want to just take a look at the questions? I think, Sridevi, I don't know if, I think the first one may have been addressed. I think the second one also probably to some extent, but Swarna, Felina, you want to kind of...
Yeah. Felina, will you like to take up the second question? Are the clinical trials for novel ingredients clearly defined?
So for novel food, there are regulations, because it's clearly mentioned that clinical trials will be required for novel foods, because they basically don't have any sort of, they aren't in any other jurisdiction, and they're only there in, like, this is a new novel food into the market. So you will have clinical trials, and the process and the manner in which you go about the clinical trials and all of that is provided under the regulations. So they are clearly defined, and they're provided under the regulations that novel food manufacturers will have to comply with.
Okay, so is it only under the regulations that is there, or is there any standards which we need to follow separately? Is the ICMR standards or something?
Yes, it is given under the new Drugs and Controls Act regulations. And yes, it has been defined there.
Okay. Sridevi, I hope you've answered that, but we'll come back to you. I think at the end of this thing, we'll open it up for more questions and more discussion. I think the next question was, is there any requirement of health certification when exporting novel food ingredients?
So there is a certificate required, which is a certificate of analysis, Sridevi, from a third-party lab, which is accredited by National Accreditation Board for Testing and Calibration Laboratories. This certificate itself should include any physical, chemical, and microbiological parameters which is relevant to the product, along with your validate test methods and other test methods, if there are any references with, for producing this ingredient. I hope that answers the question.
But yeah, in case of novel vegan foods, is clinical animal trials mandatory? No, when it comes to vegan foods, you cannot have any clinical trials, clinical animal trials. It's not allowed. So so therefore it is not allowed. There can't be any animal clinical trials if it's vegan food. Okay. Can we move on?
Yeah. So also quickly looking at the packaging regulations for novel foods. So materials which come into direct contact with food, which is used for packaging, preparation, storing, wrapping, transportation, and sale of food products will need to be of a certain food grade quality, which is prescribed under the regulations. And also the food products will need to be packed in clean, hygienic, and tamper-proof packages or containers. There are also specific, rules for certain types of packaging materials. For example, tin containers, which are once used, cannot be reused for the packaging of food. Also, printing inks for use on the food packages will need to conform to certain standards prescribed under the regulations. There are also printed services. For example, printed services, surfaces of packaging materials which have ink on it cannot come into direct contact with the food or food product, unless they obtain a certificate of conformity, which is issued by the National Accreditation Board for Testing and Calibration Laboratories. So if they get that particular accreditation by the laboratory, then they can have their food packages come into contact with their food product. So these are certain basic requirements under the labeling and packaging requirements for novel foods. In addition to these requirements, you also have regulations which cover the advertising of food products. I think, Swarna, will you like to give us an understanding of what the advertising food regulations cover?
Yes. Thank you, Felina, for your insights. So the next segment is pertaining to your advertisement and claims made by food business operator on their food products. The regulation that governs these claims and advertisements is the Food Safety Standard Advertising and Claim Regulation of 2018. This regulation contains general principles to be followed by the food business operator when they are making these claims. Like it lays down that the claims should be truthful, unambiguous, not misleading, and helpful to the consumers. And it should also not encourage or condone any consumption of food. One other thing is that any claim which is made regarding your nutritional or health attributes, it should be scientifically substantiated. These regulation also lays down the criteria for your nutrition claims, your health claims, and non-addition claims, and even the claims that are prohibited. To give you a few examples, like no product can make a claim regarding the suitability of food for use in the prevention, elevation, treatment, or even cure of a disease or disorder unless it is permitted under any other FSS Act. And even phrases such as recommended by medical, nutrition, or health professions is permitted on the food products. There can be no claims made which undermines other manufacturers' products as well. If the FBOs require a prior approval for making any claim, procedure is prescribed under these regulations, and in case of any non-compliance, the redressal as well is given under the regulation. This brings us to the end of our presentation, and before we end our session today, we have a few concluding thoughts. It is not wrong to say that the cost of many novel foods remain premium than the traditional food and is hence less accessible to masses owing to its production scales, the regulatory framework out there, and even the ongoing market research. Like we were speaking to one of our client a few days ago, and who mentioned that one of the novel ingredient for which they have taken a prior approval, the ingredient itself is constituting 70 to 80% of the total production cost, which ends up making the cost of that end product higher than in comparison to product which is conventionally produced. So the other thing is that novel food can radically impact the consumer's diet, but people are not aware of it, as the research, as I said, is still ongoing and in the development phase. Plant-based dairy and meat alternatives are emerging as a sustainable solution, and hence global policymakers must emphasize on the research and even accept these novel technologies that offers these solutions so that the global nutrition gap can be built in. uh, like this Swachh Bharat mission, which focused on sanitation, it was the world's largest nudge campaign, and it changed habits of millions of Indians. So similar nudges can be employed to change India's eating habits as well, to move to nutritionally rich, sustainable food. We have seen to some extent there is a behavioral change in consumers in the bigger cities, as they're generally willing to try these novel foods and even understand the nutritional information of the food product. Even FDA published a consumer behavior trend in 2019, which indicated that 87% of the people look at the nutritional information of the food. Hence, these products, hence the novel food, must be developed taking cognizance of the nutritional adequacy, sensory acceptance of the consumer, and even the sustainability issue. Praveen, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think a few more to add, right? So I think that if we look at, like I said in the beginning, I think that there has to be for the a growth in the industry and a push to the right direction, there have to be policy initiatives. Thanks to the government, I think that they have come out with certain such schemes and policies. One of them being, of course, the Kisan Sampada Yojana, the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Sampada Yojana. The second is, of course, the PLI schemes which have been announced across sectors, but the food processing industry is one of them. The Sampada Yojana is helping in create integrated cold chains and value addition infrastructure, agro processing clusters, helping in modernizing food processing and preservation capabilities. So all of that has kind of helped in kind of helping the food business operators in India kind of innovate and come out with novel foods and look at new technologies, etc. Even multiple agencies of the Government of India, such as the Department of Science and Technology, which is DST, and there's the Department of Biotechnology, both under the Ministry of Science and Technology, have shown considerable interest in research and development of, alternative proteins, cultivated meat, and all of that. All of this is also kind of, when we look at FDI, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think that we've seen a fair bit of activity in the food sector in FDI, through FDI. It's also driven by the fact that when it comes to FDI, the regulatory framework for FDI permits 100% under the automatic route when it comes to the food processing sector. Of course, on retail for food, there is a restriction. It is 100%, but you need the approval of the Government of India. So that they've kind of tried to control, because retail, of course, is a sensitive topic when it comes to kind of some amount of protectionism is there. And when it comes to food, it's larger. Maybe for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, we won't go into that. But I think all of these initiatives and all of the moves by the government has helped in creating a larger number of food business operators and entrepreneurs getting into this space. We are working with a wide range of clients across this space. be it in nutraceuticals, be it in animal food. I think across the verticals. So I think that this is we are hoping that all of these right initiatives do help in moving forward the food processing industry. Thank you. I think that's largely our concluding thoughts. But let me see if we have any more questions. I think there was one question from Ravindra Babu, which I'm not sure if I answered correctly. The question is, in case of novel vegan foods, is clinical, I'm leaving animal out, because when it comes to vegan, like I said, animal is not, testing on animals is not allowed. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, you're right.
There. But is clinical trials mandatory, right? Felina, you want to take that?
Yeah, so like I'd mentioned, for if it's a novel food, then clinical trials are mandatory. It was provided in one of the FAQs released by the FSSAI that for non-specified or for novel foods, you will have to have clinical trials, because again, the intent is that there is no other information available in the market for its use, for its end use, right? So for novel foods, it is a requirement, and you have so although the FAQ had referred to the drugs rules of 1945, which had a schedule specifically on clinical trials, but that was repealed by the 2019 new drugs and clinical trials regulations. So now FBOs, if they're conducting novel foods, will have to follow those particular regulations.
Right. I think there was one other question by Sri Devi, which is, could you please provide the reference for clinical trials for novel ingredients, the law which you had mentioned?
I think,
Sorry.
yeah, it's the new drugs and clinical trials rules of 2019.
Yeah, we can send that across to you by email as well. I think Sri Devi wants to speak.
Thanks for the wonderful webinar. The quick question is, because before even approval, how will we actually start on the clinical trials for a novel product? That seems slightly odd, isn't it? Because before even getting an approval, do you mean to say that we can start on the clinical trials for novel ingredients? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, so thanks, Devi. So basically, the FSSAI determines whether a certain product, like while it's doing its prior product approval process, determines whether a certain product requires clinical trials to be done. And once it determines that, then it will allow for clinical testing to be done. It depends on the kind of product you're doing. It's mostly from what we've seen, it's mostly for example, like a nutraceutical product, which is targeting a particular, sector or community, or for example, mothers or lactating mothers. So basically, they check whether a particular product will require clinical trial, and based on that determination, they will allow an FBO to conduct clinical trials during the process.
Basically, we need to apply for the same and then get an approval, prior approval.
Correct. So I think, so the process would be largely, I think the process would be to kind of get to a stage where they are satisfied about the safety requirements, etc., and then proceed to clinical trials. Correct me if I'm wrong, Felina. I think that's the process. Yes.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Thanks.
Okay. Perfect. Any other questions? Okay. Perfect. Thank you. I think this is our, I think our contact details are provided in the last page, and I think that you have all of our email IDs, etc. If there's anything that you need to reach out to us for, please feel free to do so. Thank you again. Thank you for taking the time and attending the webinar. Thank you. Bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you.